welcome to the Anne Frank Uncovering the Girl Behind the Diary webinar. It's really great to see you here tonight. I'm Isabelle and I'm from 2Simple, and I worked on the resource with Jillian Warsnperry MBE. Jillian was the co-founder and vice president of the Anne Frank Trust and has over 25 years experience of working with schools on the topic of Anne Frank. And it's great that Jillian is here with us this evening, and she's going to give you an overview of the resource. So what we're going to do for this session is to, first of all, give an overview of the resource. So I'm going to hand over to Jillian, who's going to talk about why the resource was created and why it's important for Year 6 pupils to study Anne Frank. Then we're going to talk about what Jillian and I thought we wanted to do with the resource, then give some tips for use in the classroom, and then it's going to be an opportunity for you to ask either Jillian or myself any questions. So I'm just going to hand over to Jillian to give you a proper introduction to what we did.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Welcome, everybody. It's been fantastic working on this resource. It's an almost natural follow-on from the resource pack that we did on Holocaust Memorial Day earlier this year. But with this resource, using Anne Frank, what we're really doing is homing in on one person and one person's life and experience. Obviously, with the Holocaust Memorial Day resource, we talked about numbers and the incredible amount of people that were victims of the Holocaust. But with this pack, we really bring the young girl Anne Frank to life. Now, I know that many primary schools do use Anne Frank. Secondary schools do as well. They study it at a different level because, of course, Anne Frank was 13 when she started writing her diary. So she was a little older than the Year 6 pupils that we're targeting with this pack. But nonetheless, 11-year-olds really relate to Anne. Basically because of so much of what she wrote about, they can relate to their own lives. And so this is what we're really doing for that final year of primary, before the children are moving on to big school, to secondary school. We're really sort of drilling down and looking at some of the topics that Anne wrote about and how those topics can actually relate to young people today. And what we hope to do with this is help to develop the children's moral framework in the same way that over the 2 years that Anne was writing her diary, she was developing her own moral framework. Now, the other reason that young people can relate so strongly to Anne is not only because they can read what she wrote and they think, well, I could have written this. You know, she's writing about what I'm thinking about. But also we have an incredible resource of photographs of Anne and her older sister Margot growing up, an unusually large resource of photographs. And that's because her father, Otto Frank, was an amateur photographer, a passionate photographer. He had a lovely camera, Leica, in the 1920s that he bought himself. And as his two daughters were growing up, his twin passions became his little girls and photographing them. So we've got an enormous amount of photos, and we really see that girl sometimes looking extremely modern. Now, I've chosen this particular photograph to show you on this slide because I was very fortunate through the years that I was working at the Anne Frank Trust and running it to meet many people that knew Anne Frank personally. And so they've shared their personal recollections of her with me. And this particular photo was taken about 25 years ago in Anne's bedroom at the Anne Frank house. And I'm standing there with Miep Gies, who was the heroic helper of the Frank family in hiding. And so you can imagine the thrill and honor of standing in Anne's bedroom with Miep. So what we're saying is these are real people. Anne Frank might be an iconic name, but at the end of the day, she was a little girl. In some ways, an extraordinary little girl because she was very intelligent, she was very feisty, she had views on everything, but in many ways, a very ordinary little girl who just wanted the opportunity to live out her life. The Holocaust Memorial Day pack that I talked about earlier that is on the Purple Mash website gives a much more in-depth presentation of the Holocaust. But what we're doing here with this pack is we've we've selected certain topics that Anne writes about so articulately, that the young people will actually relate to their lives, both in school and out of school. And hopefully the things that they learn about and discuss, they will carry forward with them into their careers and their future time in secondary school, and then onwards into their adult life and their careers. And probably most important of those is the feeling of personal responsibility for the other. And despite the terrible, terrible situation that Anne found herself in hiding, every single day waking up in fear of being arrested and taken away to a concentration camp with the thought of imminent death, she still felt a responsibility for making the world better. And that's what we want to instill in the young people that are going to be using this pack. Now, I have seen for myself over the course of over 25 years that I was running the trust and going into primary schools, how effective learning about Anne Frank can be for Year 6 pupils. And in particular, about their concerns, addressing their concerns about transition, about going on, leaving the comfort of their own school, their small environment, the teachers that they know, and going into a much bigger environment. And I've actually even been into schools where they've had displays of their work on Anne Frank at the end of the year. And one particular school in North London did Anne Frank throughout the final year of final term of Year 6, every single year. And it resulted in a wonderful exhibition of the children's work that it had generated, that the mayor would always come and visit. And in fact, a group of those pupils would go with their teacher to the Anne Frank house at the end of the year. Now, I'm not saying that everyone's got to do that, but it's a lovely thing to aim towards, an actual visit to the Anne Frank house as part of that sort of rite of passage of moving from primary school to secondary school. Another thing about Anne Frank, using her as a tool to really talk honestly about topics that sometimes are a little bit difficult, a little bit personal, is because she's a historical figure. But because we've got inside her mind through her writing, and also we see these photographs of her, she's a historical figure, but yet she's modern. She's someone that the kids themselves can relate to. And it's always much easier to tackle difficult topics that have occurred in the classroom or home, out of the classroom, etc., through the prism of history. And Anne Frank is a wonderful tool for doing that. Now, when we came to write this resource, Isabelle and I sort of sat down and thought about, well, Isabelle, we started out with about 6 topics, 6 different topics that Anne writes about in her diary that those young people could relate to. But actually that expanded, and I think there's actually 9 topics now. And we looked at sort of Anne's diary, and we made the decision to choose some very different topics to talk about. So we talk about writing as a tool for self-expression. And we look at, of course, Anne's diary. By the way, here's a little facsimile of her diary with the lock as well. In her diary, Anne was writing for herself. And it wasn't until about 2 years into the hiding, when she'd been writing rigorously for 2 years, that she decided she would love to have it published. So she actually started editing her diary with a view to it being published after the war. And of course it was. So we look at the difference between writing something that is essentially for yourself, but also the difference in writing something that you want to be seen and published. And that actually has a great relevance to young people's lives now, because so much of what they write is to go on social media such as Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. So there's a very, very good activity which Isabelle will tell you a little bit more about, about the difference between writing for yourself or for public consumption. And then we look at personal growth And this is a very important time in a child's life when they are changing not only emotionally, but they're going to be changing physically as well. So we talk about how Anne describes her own personal growth over the 2 years that she was in hiding. And of course, she was transitioning too from a child into an adolescent. We talk about education and attitudes to school. Anne wasn't a model pupil in school. She was a very intelligent girl, but she was very talkative and actually sometimes so disruptive in class that she had to stay behind with the teacher and do lines. She wasn't an ideal pupil from a teacher's point of view. But when she had been away from school, removed from the school environment in the hiding place, she came to really appreciate school. And when D-Day happened, what she wrote in her diary was, perhaps I can get back to school. She really started to appreciate what she was missing at school. So this is something we can discuss with children. Do they take their education and schooling for granted? What if it was taken away from them? We talk about friendship and the value of friendship, how to really recognize how valuable friendship is. Again, Anne was removed from her friends. Her friends were very important to her, whether they were her girlfriends or her boyfriends. She agonized and ached from being removed from her social life. And how important are friends to you? We even actually we mentioned about the adults and their relationships in the hiding place. We talk about something very important and very relevant for today, which is otherness. And Anne was persecuted. She suffered a terrible death because she was considered different. And of course, what a boring world it would be if we were all clones of each other and we were all the same. And so we look particularly in areas where there are large immigrant communities and communities of refugees, not so much at what is different about each other, but what do we have in common? And thinking about the problems that those children's families may have incurred in having to remove themselves, like the Franks did from Germany, and find themselves in a completely new country speaking a different language. We talk about family relations, something that's very important as young people are growing up. Are the dynamics within the family going to change through year 6 and as they go into year 7? Relations with their parents. Are their parents going to still consider them as children, or are they going to start treating them as older, more responsible young people with views of their own, which Anne desperately tried to get across to her parents, that she was entitled to her own points of view? And also sibling relationships, sibling rivalries. Anne had a great sibling rivalry with her own sister Margot. We talk about young people's priorities, and we can relate that back actually to what they went through when they were isolated during the lockdown. What were their priorities? What were going to be the most important things that they had missed and would appreciate, and what are they going to be their priorities in life moving forward? Talk about the value of leisure and entertainment in our lives. Of course, Anne was in hiding, but she didn't have the opportunities that we have today, that even though you might be isolated from the community, you can still switch on the TV and choose what you want to watch. So leisure and entertainment. Anne was a very gregarious girl before she went into hiding. She loved going skating. She loved going to the cinema, and all that was taken away from her. What would we miss? And the final topic that we talk about is nature and the environment. And Anne readily admits in her diary that before she went into hiding, she had taken the natural world and nature for granted. And she never really looked around her. She was more interested in her friends and what was going on. But when nature was taken away from her, when she was isolated from it, shut up in those small rooms, and all she could see was the top of a chestnut tree from a top window for 2 years, how important those few leaves came to be, and how she realized that she had taken nature for granted. So you see, there's a wide range of different topics, and we can have a lot of very interesting discussions going on. Now, the other thing is that we would like this to be a sort of two-way conversation about using this pack, because for us, we've just launched it and we want to hear back from you. And as the year progresses and you're using the pack and perhaps listening to this webinar, we really want you to share your experiences and what's come through from the children themselves by using this pack, and some experiences that you've had in using it, and any observations that you have as well that you'd like to share with us. We'd love to hear from you. So I think probably that's me finished for now, and I'm going to hand over to Isabelle, who's going to talk a little bit more depth about the activities and the learning objectives.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jillian. So when we sort of sat down and started thinking about the resource, we were really keen to think it should be used across the Year 6 curriculum, and that there could be lots of very interesting conversations that could be had throughout the year, as Jillian has just talked about. And for us, it was about creating a clearer picture of the girl behind the diary. So she wasn't just a character, she wasn't just the author of the diary, but she was actually a real person with feelings and hopes and ideas and aspirations. So we felt that that was really important, and we wanted to encourage pupils to develop a sense of empathy for what Anne and her family were going through. And then with the questions and the activities in the pack, to think about how the subjects that were covered in the topic can relate to the pupils' own lives. So again, we thought those were the three most important things that we wanted to focus on. So we have got lots of images and quotes in the resource, and they are in each of the sections. And if you wanted to use any of the images or any of the quotes in the classroom, there is an appendix at the back of the pack so that you can use it on your screen in the classroom, which we hope will find useful. We've also put together a timeline which has key dates for Anne, but then also for things that were happening around her. So the enabling act, so again, it can all be put into a much wider context. And then we've put together for each topic some questions that will get the pupils thinking about their own lives and how the topics that have been discovered relate to themselves. So moving on to, for some of the activities, we've created this comparing template, and this activity can be used for 5 of activities. Here I've only just mentioned 3, but the first one links to what Jillian was saying, that the diary was written first for Anne herself, but then she was rewriting it for public use. So we're asking the pupils to write one paragraph. It might be about themselves or about their friends for themselves to read, but then they're going to rewrite it for others to read, and then think about why they're different and why they're not. We then look at how pupils' perceptions of themselves are different or the same as their pupils, teachers and guardians. So again, that links with the relationship that Anne had with her family, and whether Anne's parents saw the real her. And then we talk about nature and the fact that Anne was very interested in the tree that she saw outside her window. So we think about the impact of nature on someone's well-being. So thinking about the scenery outside the classroom, and then thinking about the ideal scenery that they would have and how that would impact on their well-being and their ability to study. Then the next activity is a tracking questions, which links to how much Anne changed during her time in hiding. So here we have the same questions that are answered in September and in June, and then the pupils can compare the answers and think about why they're the same and why they're different. And then the third and final activity was the Manifesto. So this was linking to the impact that war had on Anne and the fact that she had a strong belief about how others should be treated. So here we're asking pupils to create a manifesto for Year 7, so to think about who they want to be and what they would like to be like. So this is where we would really like to hear from teachers. So we're asking teachers to share manifestos with us in July using the hashtag transition, and then the winning manifestos will receive book or stationery vouchers. So all of the activities that I've just gone through can be completed either at the back of the pack, so we've got templates, or they can be completed on Purple Mash. Before I move on to questions, I'm just going to show you what it looks like on Purple Mash. Now be able to see the Anne Frank section that we've created on Purple Mash. So the resource is this PDF here, and then if you go into any of the activities, you have some information about the activity, and then some more activity and some information about who was Anne Frank. And then this is the tracking questions, but on the side panel you've got the questions. You've got a pop-up of all the questions so that the pupils can be reminded about the questions when they are answering the questions. And each of the 3 activities has these sidebars to help go through them.